It's time to huddle up. I'm Garrett Searine. This is the Daily Huddle for Tuesday, September 5th. Thanks for making us a part of your day, however it is, wherever it is you're doing so. We certainly appreciate it. If you're watching on YouTube, hit the subscribe button. Give us a thumbs up. It goes a long way in helping us get in front of more college football fans, and that's always a good thing. And also, if you're listening on the podcast, you can give us a 5-star review, and we'll read your 5-star reviews here on the show. One singular topic today, and I think it's the topic and the focus of the college football world today, and it's Clemson. Things did not go well on Labor Day for Clemson, and you could have maybe shielded it if it wasn't the only college football game going on in prime time and really the only big sporting event going on in prime time on Labor Day. Things did not go well. A 28-7 loss on the road at Duke, a team that should not instill a whole lot of like, oh, man, look out for the Dukies. Now, they are going to be pretty good, and I think Mike Elko is doing just a phenomenal job at Duke. I think that's a tough place to win, and he's a great candidate to be a hot commodity come this coming off season, and I think you saw the reason why last night. And even despite the 28-7 loss where Clemson at times didn't even look competitive, I'm still not 100% there in the – I'm still not willing to put the nails in the coffin of the Clemson – I think the Clemson dynasty, yes, is over. I think that's abundantly clear. But I'm not willing to put the final nail in the coffin that they can't resurrect this thing. And I know that that is somewhat apprehensive, and I know that that feels almost incorrect because your eyes didn't deceive you. Duke was the better team on the field last night, which should be a concern for not just Clemson, but the rest of the ACC, that I think as a whole, the sum of the parts, Duke was better than Clemson. And yet I still can't find myself ready to nail that coffin shut. I know that I should be. I know that I should be, and yet I can't. Because it was ugly. Ugly loss. If you go the entire second half and you don't score a point, but you also didn't punt, bad. That's bad football, especially in week one. And I it's a tough place to be because Duke tried to give that game away, frankly, especially in the first half. Tried to give that game away, and Clemson just never took it. So, and I don't know if this is an autopsy almost of what happened to Clemson. Clemson, what happened? But it's bad. It's bad. So let's go through the autopsy of what happened at Clemson. And I think, and this sucks if you're a Clemson fan and is one of the downsides of college football. Clemson is a victim of its own success. Flat out. I don't think there's another way to put it. Clemson is a victim of the success that it put together. It recruited players at a really high level for a while. So then its roster gets stacked, and so players go elsewhere because there's not a path to the field, or I don't want to sit and wait until I'm a junior. So you go somewhere else. That's a tough spot to be in, that you are penalized for being really good. But yet, the same situation happens at Alabama and Ohio State and Notre Dame and Georgia and Texas and Oklahoma and USC. But for some reason, Clemson wasn't able to sustain that, and that's an issue. You compound that with Dabo Swinney showed a willingness to cast dudes aside pretty quickly. And it started with, I think, Kelly Bryant, who didn't do anything other than just exist before Trevor Lawrence was ready to be the full-time starter. That's the only football sin Kelly Bryant committed. He wasn't a bad player. He didn't throw a bunch of interceptions. He didn't lead Clemson to a bunch of bad losses. They just had recruited and signed Trevor Lawrence. It's the only thing he did wrong. And I think that sends a message to recruits of when Kelly Bryant gets cast aside for Trevor Lawrence is you can do everything that your coach asks of you to do. You can be the team player. You can sit and wait your time, wait your turn. And you can still perform at a really high level. And yet you still run the risk of your coach being like, nah, we're going to go with this guy instead. And now, I'm not saying that's the wrong choice. Obviously, it wasn't the wrong choice. Things went really well for Clemson with Trevor Lawrence. And Trevor Lawrence went on to be, as you know, the number 1 overall pick in the NFL draft and is having a pretty good NFL career right now. I'm not saying that Dabo Swinney made the wrong decision, but you send a message to recruits that when you're willing to cast aside a guy who has done everything you've asked of him and done all the right things and all those cliches that coaches ask of their players and still got replaced, that message exists. And you did the same thing with DJ Uiagalelei, that he didn't play poorly. He just didn't play as great as you thought he did, and you chose Cade Klubnik instead. Again, I'm not here to decide whether that is the right answer or not, but I think it's difficult to be like, hey, you know, DJ Uiagalelei sat and waited his turn behind Trevor Lawrence, did all the right things that everybody asked of him. And what was his reward? He got cast aside at the first sign of trouble, and Clemson started Cade Klubnik instead. So I think that sends a message to players of in some circumstances you can do everything that's asked of you and it still not be good enough. And there is a life lesson there. But if my options are I can do everything you ask of me and you still might cast me aside while this other guy over here at this other school is going to be my ride or die, it's an easy decision. And I think guys started making that decision. I think on the flip side of being, I guess not on the flip side of its success, but in addition to being a victim of its own success, is when you have that success, your coaches are going to be a hot commodity. Your position coaches are going to be a hot commodity for coordinator positions. Your coordinators are going to be hot commodities for head coaching positions. And since the 2015 season, 3 Clemson coordinators have went on to become head coaches. 2 of them in Power 5, 1 of them in Group of 5 that Group of 5 school thinks they should be a Power 5. But when Jeff Scott, Tony Elliott, and Brent Venables leave your program, you're losing really good coaches. It's clear they're good coaches. Now, those 3 fan bases might argue that they might not be great head coaches. Jeff Scott has already been fired by South Florida. Tony Elliott, you could argue, is working on it. And Brent Venables did not have a great debut season at Oklahoma. But their work as coordinators speaks for itself. When you take a look at from 2015 to 2019, 14-1, 14-1, 12-2, 15-0, 14-1, where you win 2 national titles and you lose 2 national titles, it is undeniable that those 3 coaches were 1, really good coaches, and then 2, imperative to Clemson's success. Because when you look at their records after Tony Elliott, Jeff Scott, and Brent Venables have departed, you see a noticeable difference. Clemson lost 5 games in 5 years when those 3 guys were coordinators. And in the last 3 years, they've lost 8 games. And now to start the 2023 season, they're 0-1. So you can see the downturn from Clemson. You can see by the record from 2015 to 2019, where they're at their peak, where they are the pretty much only school competing with Alabama for national championships. In 2019, they lost a national championship to LSU, who will go down as one of the best college football teams of all time, the 2019 LSU Tigers. So in a 5-year stretch there, where 12-2 is the worst you do, where you still, I think, win the conference. Or in 2017, they won the conference and lost a New Year's Six bowl game. If that's the worst you're doing in a 5-year stretch, it's pretty impressive. It's pretty good. You have a lot to be proud of. But then when you see, okay, Jeff Scott and Tony Elliott, Jeff Scott leaves in 2020. They go 10-2. Tony Elliott leaves after the 2021 season. So does Brent Venables. They go from 10-3, 11-3. The losses start piling up when you see when those guys leave. Now, I'm not saying that those are the only reasons why Clemson sees and experiences a downturn, because I mentioned that I think the message, you're a victim of your own success. You're building your roster, and then guys start to go, wait a second, there's 5-star there, 5-star there, 5-star there. I'm never going to get on the field as a left guard. It's easy to look elsewhere at that point. But then your position coaches start to look at becoming coordinators. Your coordinators start to look at becoming head coaches. So you replace really good offensive coordinators, and I don't think that you can argue that they're not good head coaches, and that's fine. You might win that argument. They're very good coordinators. Jeff Scott, Tony Elliott, Brent Venables. Very good coordinators. Then you replace them. So Brandon Streeter becomes the offensive coordinator, and it didn't go perfectly for Clemson. So what did they do? Similar to DJ Uiagalelei, similar to Kelly Bryant, Dabo Swinney kicks him to the curb, a guy who devoted a long time to the program, and maybe he wasn't up to the standard that Tony Elliott and Jeff Scott set. Oh, by the by, see ya. And then you hire Garrett Riley. And Garrett Riley deserves a Power 5 offensive coordinator job. He did a great job at TCU, and Clemson went all in to go get him, and justifiably so. But it wasn't a great performance last night. And when you're trying to catch that lightning in a bottle again, it's really difficult. And speaking of the style that Clemson played, with Brent Venables, Clemson was able to play a style of defense that not many other schools could replicate. They couldn't match it. It's difficult to pull off, but you need to recruit at that high level. And then when you're built your defense and built your scheme on playing with 5-star players and getting the best of the best, and you're no longer pulling in the best of the best, it's really difficult to pull off. And despite all of that, I'm still not ready to put that nail in the coffin. The ACC is a weak league, and I think will be somewhat of a weak league for the foreseeable future. I think it's pretty definitive at this point that the ACC is now Florida State's league to dominate. But Clemson's not going to go back to 8-4. They're going to be, I think, still 10-2-ish. Are there days for competing for the national championship over? If they don't get things turned around in the next 8 months or so, yes. But I think Dabo Swinney is still going to have a lot of cachet with recruits. He's still going to have a lot of cachet with potential coordinators and position coaches. And I think that university, that coaching staff, that program is still going to be viewed in really high regard for up-and-coming coaches who are hungry and want to be coordinators and want to be future head coaches and things like that. I think it's just the reality of, hey, we've got a history and a reputation of winning championships, playing at a high level, but then also advancing guys on in their careers, both on the field and in the coaching profession. So I don't think it's impossible for them to resurrect this thing. I also don't know how likely it is, though, either. I don't know if there is a path that is just like flat out, okay, what we're going to do is XYZ, and then everything is great, hunky dory, all is forgiven, and we're back to being that national championship caliber team. I think NIL plays a little bit into it just because, frankly, Clemson is fan base wise second fiddle in its own state. South Carolina runs, or the majority of people in South Carolina are South Carolina fans. They're not Clemson fans. So I think there's a struggle there as well. But maybe most importantly, I don't think it's a coincidence that Clemson's downturn, I hesitate to use the word fall because 12-2 and 11-3 aren't necessarily a fall. I don't think it is a coincidence that the downfall of Clemson coincides with the rise of Georgia. I think there's a correlation there where Georgia becomes the preeminent power in not just the Southeast, but in college football at the same time where Clemson starts to take a hit. And you talk about the success that Clemson recruited with started to fall off a little bit. Well, why? You get your roster stacked. There are opportunities at other places like Georgia, where you can go compete for national championships and also get on the field. Clemson built its program on getting kids from Georgia. Its biggest recruit, Trevor Lawrence, a Georgia kid. It went into Georgia and other southeastern states, plucked the best players, and put them on its roster. Well, now Georgia does that. Georgia made the investment with Kirby Smart that we're going to be the one to run the block. Yeah, Georgia's now keeping the best kids in state for the most part. And also, Georgia's playing defense the way Clemson used to, which is attractive for defensive linemen and defensive backs. If you want to be a first-round DB, you want to be a first-round cornerback, Clemson used to be an attractive position because they're going to put you on an island and you got to lock down your receiver. If you want to be a first-round defensive end, Clemson was an attractive place because we're going to rush the passer. We're going to put you isolated on a tackle and you got to get there. And if you can do that, we're going to develop you and teach you how to get there. But if you can do that, you're going to end up in the NFL. Well, Georgia does that now. Georgia plays defense the way Clemson used to play defense. So it was an attractive recruiting destination for defensive linemen and defensive backs. Clemson doesn't have those guys anymore. You watched that game last night. There wasn't a Vic Beasley on the field for Clemson. There wasn't a Grady Jarrett on the field for Clemson. Those guys just didn't exist last night because they're going elsewhere. For the most part, Dabo Swinney built Clemson around quarterbacks, wide receivers, and offensive and defensive linemen. And they just don't have that personnel anymore. That essentially, if I can out-recruit you at these four position groups, I'm going to win 90% of my games. And that's not a Clemson special. That's not a secret. If I've got the best offensive and defensive line, things are going to go my way more often than not, a lot. And Clemson just doesn't have that anymore. They don't dominate on offensive and defensive line, and they don't dominate outside and with a smart decision-making athletic quarterback. That's just the reality of the situation. All of those, not all of those guys, but you look at the offensive and defensive lines for Georgia the last 2 years, last 3 years, 4 years, kind of 5 years, have been filled with monsters. Clemson doesn't really have that anymore. Now, it seems like an easy and obvious fix of like, hey, we're just going to go out and recruit the best offensive and defensive linemen we can find. If it was that simple, they just would have done it. So there's more to it than that. And that's, I think, why I'm hesitant to put that final nail in the coffin, because if you can fix these two position groups, you're back to probably champion of the ACC and competing for a college football playoff berth. If you can get back to recruiting the best wide receivers and quarterbacks in America, you're right there. Now, again, easier said than done, but they're not far off. But the problem is that defensively, Duke looked much better than Clemson did defensively. There have to be question marks, and there has to be soul searching and a reevaluation. And frankly, I don't know if Dabo Swinney has if he can put that ego aside to say, there might be, we might need to do this differently. We might have to do this a different way, and there might be a better way than what we're doing. I don't know if he's got that ability or not. But I do know, and I think Clemson is the new Notre Dame, and that is not a compliment, where they are overranked to start the season in the preseason. And I think it's happened a couple of times recently where Clemson is ranked as a top 5 team. Like, oh man, look out for the Tigers this year. They were the number 9 team in the country last night. Did that look like the 9th best team in America to you last night? Because it didn't to me. So they're overranked coming into the season. They lose a game early when they Clemsoning somebody, which Dabo Swinney, like, we don't lose to people we shouldn't. Like, well, what the hell do you call last night then? So they get the benefit of the doubt, which championship teams do. When Alabama can lose to whoever the hell, or no, not Texas, but if Alabama lost over the weekend, maybe not that bad of a loss, but if Alabama gets beat by 14 by Texas on Saturday, we will excuse that loss because it's Alabama. They get the benefit of the doubt, and they've earned the benefit of the doubt. Clemson, for a 5-year stretch there, earned the benefit of the doubt. Or if they lost a game, you can pass it off as a fluke. But then when they lose their second game is when somebody then starts to be like, oh, you know what? Maybe they're not as good as we thought they were. And that's the Notre Dame model of Notre Dame will be ranked for, I don't know, the last 30 years in the top 15. They'll lose a game, and then you're like, well, it's a tough schedule, tough situation, blah, blah, blah. And then when they lose the second game, you're like, oh, you know what? Maybe we need to reevaluate because maybe they're not as good as we thought they were. And it's happened the last couple of years with Clemson that they got the benefit of the doubt. And now I think they're at the point where they shouldn't get that benefit of the doubt. Where if they lost, maybe it's just that the other team was better than them, that there wasn't a fluke situation. You can't explain it away. There are no excuses. Was Duke better than Clemson last night? Yeah, they were. And that should be scary for the ACC, but also for Clemson. That the Vanderbilt / Purdue / Washington State / Baylor of your conference looked better than you is a scary situation to be in. But it's not completely unfixable. It's not to the point where, like, oh my gosh, I don't know how we're ever going to turn this thing around, because it's still possible. I don't know if you then say, hey, let's get the band back together. Let's hire Jeff Scott to be the offensive coordinator. If Tony Elliott, things don't work out at Virginia, we'll bring him back. I think I know where Clemson goes from here. I just wonder if the hubris can be put aside to say, maybe we've got to look at things differently than we have in the past. And I know that that's a difficult thing to do going into week 2, and reevaluating those things, making changes is obviously more of an off-season thing or end-of-season thing rather than a week 2. All right, we got to figure this out. But they got to figure some things out, and quickly. Otherwise, I'm guessing they don't want to go back to the dark days of being 8-4 or 9-3. I don't think the future is as bleak as people are painting today. But I also don't know that there is a path for Clemson to return to being on top of the college football world relatively soon either. That'll do it for today's edition of the Daily Huddle. Again, if you're watching on YouTube, hit us up on, or if you're watching on YouTube, hit the subscribe button and hit the thumbs up. It goes a long way. And if you get listening on the podcast, drop the 5-star review. We'll read them on the air. We certainly appreciate you making us a part of your day, however it is, wherever it is you're doing so. And we'll catch you tomorrow right here on the Daily Huddle with Saturday Glory.